And we're back with David Kennedy to talk about grief. So David, we've been talking a lot about different types of grief. We've been talking about some of the things we can do to someone who's going through a grief process. I wanted to ask you, when we're talking about grief, does it ever end, or is it the mourning that comes to an end, or does the mourning have to come to an end?
So grief never comes to an end, but it changes. So the reason why it never ends is that the relationship still is part with us. If we are successful in adapting the relationship from what it was to what it is now in a good way, it will stay with us. The mourning pieces, how we mourn, will gradually change, although they can continue forever as well. And I'll give a few examples of that. So when we talk about the relationship changing and grief never ending, there's a little term that I use with clients, and I call it a stug.
A stug.
S-T-U-G.
Okay.
And it means a sudden, temporary urge of grief. So it's funny, I had one of these a little while ago. So my dad died in 2000, so 23 years ago. And I was out down at the market actually a week or so ago, and there was a guy who was selling fish, pickerel. And when I walked by, I had a stug.
You had a stug.
About my dad, 23 years ago. My dad was a huge fisherman, and pickerel was one of his favorite fish. And all of a sudden, I just had this great memory of Dad fishing, and I felt sad that he wasn't here. So it lasted a minute, and I was okay. I had a great feeling, great thought. Actually, it was a good thing. It wasn't negative, but it was a grief. It's a stug, sudden, temporary. It goes away. You do what you need to do, and then we carry on. So that's why I say that grief never ends, because we'll always have reminders of relationships. Stugs that will come our way, that will bring us back to that person. And that's a good thing, because I love those stories and those memories. The mourning, I don't need to mourn it the way I first did, because as I find ways to carry the relationship differently, but I still want to mourn that. So, for instance, I do, for one of the two of the funeral homes in Peterborough, we do a candlelight memorial at Christmas time. And people who have had somebody die are free to come, and we honor the memory of that person. There's a mourning ritual. And I have had people do that for years and years and years, and they'll continue to do it. Other people do it the first year, and then they don't need to do it anymore. So it's not like you have to do these things. Some people will visit the cemetery where their person, or wherever the remains of the person may be. They may do that on a regular basis. They may do it yearly. They may do it. But whenever they do, that's a mourning ritual. I would also say, though, whenever they tell stories about that person, they are mourning. So we often do that. I would often say, oh, you remember when Mom used to do this? Or remember when Mom used to love to say that? I'm actually mourning because I'm telling stories.
And about telling the stories, I think in our society, when someone has been grieving, the first thing we do is we don't talk about the person. It's like the elephant in the room. We don't want to talk about that person because we're afraid what emotions might surface if I ask that question. But what you're saying is that it is an expression of mourning to share those stories.
In fact, it's helpful. So you're absolutely right, Tassine. People are afraid. So I'll say, somebody will say to me, I didn't want to ask how they were or do anything like that because I was afraid of upsetting them. And my response is, they're already upset. Believe me, there's nothing you can say that's going to upset them more than they already are. What you might do is give them a chance to express what that upset looks like. And that's a gift. To be able to say to somebody is, I'm safe. You can do whatever you need to do with me. It's safe. So I don't go. So for instance, yeah, when family get together, and we will say at Christmas time at dinner, you know what? We're just going to pause and think about, all our family members who have died, and we'll name them by name. I'm honoring them, or we light a candle. But you're right, our culture has shied away because we're afraid of upsetting people. You can't upset them any more than they are, believe me. What we give them is a gift to be able to talk about it, or to say, oh, yeah, I'd love to tell you about my. That's particularly true in certain types of things. So when a parent has lost a child, nobody wants to talk about that because they're afraid. When in fact, parents need to talk about their child. They want to talk about their child. And to use the name. Those are all pieces. Those are more of our cultural challenges against mourning. We're afraid of mourning. When in fact, those are the pieces that allow people to move through their grief.
Yeah. And grief is often described as is that it is not about the person who's died, but it's about your love for them.
It's about the relationship.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's love, but sometimes it can be toxic too. But the grief is relational. So when we talk about the difference between grief and trauma, so trauma is about the event. So there can be traumatic grief, that's true. So if somebody dies, if you witness somebody dying in a car accident, let's say, the trauma is about the accident. The grief is about the relationship. So when we're working with people, if I'm working with somebody in trauma, then I'm doing trauma therapy, often the retelling of the story or of the remaking of the story. But if I'm talking to them about the grief, I want them to tell me the story of the relationship. What was that person like? Tell me about that person. What did they, how did they connect with you? So grief is the relational piece, both good and bad. Trauma is the event piece of what happened. So, and that's important to know the distinction if it's been a traumatic. And that often happens not just in sudden death. I think of people who witness some cancers can be pretty traumatic physically to watch that transformation, and people can be traumatized by that. So we're dealing with both trauma and grief, but I'm not dealing with them the same. They have to be treated differently.
So there are underlying issues that kind of surface out when we're processing grief. And sometimes it's not related to the death or the circumstance we're grieving about, but it's our own issues that come up. And so how do you navigate that?
Well, it's part of the grief. It's just simply because what it has brought up is something that's connected. So, and that's a very good point, Tassine, because you have to realize that sometimes people, what we call bury, suppress a great deal of things, either because they're children and they don't know how to deal with them, or that they are overwhelmed and they can't deal with certain things, so we push them down. And then when a death happens, if it involves something around that issue, it suddenly, it's like the box is opened. It's not just the death. It's all these other things that we've suppressed that suddenly bubble out. And that can be pretty overwhelming for people. And the way in which we do that is that we look at separating those things. So, okay, not that they're disconnected, but I can't deal with this. Let's focus on this. Can we work on this? Tell me about this. And then we'll get to this, and we'll kind of eventually be able to put it together. But that's a long process there. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's the grief that opens the doors in a lot of things. And I will say this, and I know that maybe a lot of people watching are either vets or have family members who are vets, have lived with the people coming back from war. What I learned quite early was that grief with a veteran from a war will open up all those boxes. And some of those boxes shouldn't be opened. They're not able to open them. So, as much as we'd like to think we can deal with all of that, at this point, no, let's kind of keep those things closed and focus on the grief right now. It's an awkward one, but I really do recognize that there are certain experiences of life, such as war, that it may not be helpful, but also don't be surprised that they will come up when grief is present.
So grief does much more than what we think it does.
Oh, yeah.
It totally transforms us and opens up a Pandora box sometimes.
Well, it does, and yet I come back to that grief has always been part of our life. I mean, I used to say to students, you were born in grief. You suddenly were, you got kicked out of your mother's womb,
Your
and
first thing was
you
a
were
cry.
safe and everything was good, and now here you are in this big world, and life is totally different. It's you're grieving what you left.
So David, tell us about grief in non-death situations.
And I'm glad you raised that, because when we talk about grief, we immediately think about death and that, oh, somebody died. But the truth is, our life experiences grief out of all kinds of situations. And again, the more we can appreciate that. So again, if I understand that grief is a normal response to loss, now, and I'm using loss as a definitive piece that life has changed. Something is totally different. And it's not recoverable. I don't go back to what it was. I'm experiencing a loss. Then that grief is a normal part of it. And all kinds of life has losses that we experience. And they're normal and they're good. I mean, you're a mom, you've watched your kids grow, and there's part of us that, oh, this is normal. We want them to grow. We want them to, but then all of a sudden you grieve that they're not little children anymore. And you say, oh, I miss that part of their life when I could pick them up and hold them. So life is continually changing, and every change, every major change has a new beginning, but every new beginning has an ending. And the endings produce grief. And that's where we run into trouble, because that kind of grief doesn't get recognized and doesn't get validated. And so the term we use there is called disenfranchised grief, grief that people don't see as being valid or necessary. And so we do it all the time. We don't use the term grief, but we say, I'm just kind of sad that this, or I'm sad that it's not like that, or I'm sad that's over. Those are indicators of grief that are present.
So our lives are full of them.
Our life would be, it would be something wrong if it wasn't. That's why grief is normal. I think of people, and moving is one. I think of seniors leaving their home and coming into a beautiful facility like this, which is wonderful. And I know, because I've been on lots of those conversations with family. And families say to people, oh, you'll love it there. It's great. There's people, there's friends, you'll have meals, you'll be doing trips. And that's all true. That's all true. But what are they having to leave? I have to leave my home. I have to leave the way I've lived my life, all the memories in that home. And I think it's important to acknowledge the grief piece, to say, can we mourn that? How do we mourn that grief before we start this journey?
You're absolutely right, David, specifically on the example that you just gave. Because as a chaplain working with in the long-term care, I've witnessed that all the time, is that the adjustment from moving from their home to the long-term care, it's a series of processing one grief after another. The grief of not having the ability that they had to be independent, the grief of not having the family friends, and sometimes if it's even cultural pieces, not having the language that they grew up with to be the primary language of communication, or their food that they so used to eating, it's not the same. And there's so many different levels, but it seems so minor They so seem so minor that sometimes they're not really acknowledged.
And yet they're minor, they're minor to other people.
Other people, that's
They're
it.
major
That's
to,
right.
and that's where we
That's
have to
right.
say, grief is determined not by what I think it is, but what are you experiencing? And so I really encourage you, your listeners, to recognize that. And families, I mean, families come and they don't want to see somebody unhappy, so we immediately try to make them happy. And we will get there, but I think it's okay to say, you know, I know this has been hard. What's been tough about having to leave home? And it's okay to have those conversations. There's one that I would like to zero in on our next segment, and that's the one that you've talked about, ambiguous loss, but that's going to take a little bit longer, so we'll move into that.
Yes, let's move that into our next segment. Thank you, David.